We look forward to a thoughtful and engaging discussion, one that hopefully provides more clarity on how we can move forward in these uncertain times. Thank you for joining us, and without further delay, Dr. Perota, please get us started.
Wonderful. And I'll finish putting bios in the chat after I get us started. But thank you, Letty, and thank you to all our panelists for all your work and for being with us today. And as we begin, I want to acknowledge the weight many of us have been carrying over the past 100 days. The rapid pace of executive orders and federal actions have left many of us feeling angry, frustrated, uncertain, and at times powerless and hopeless, which in part is by design. So we hope this session today can help to mitigate some of these feelings by creating a space for community, reflection, and learning where we can support one another and stay committed to the critical work we do within our field. So to begin, I'll have all the panelists answer this first question. What do you each see as the most significant shift in federal higher ed policy during the first 100 days of this administration? And how is it shaping your own work?
I'm happy to start. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to my fellow panelists for being part of this program. It's a really important conversation. Perhaps to state the obvious, but just as a macro and to start, I think the most significant shift is that we've really had to adapt from going through several years of thinking about regulations and legislation to a more limited extent that's really oriented towards supporting students and borrowers and investing in programs and strategies that improve student outcomes to an administration that's oriented toward frankly, attacking higher education and is pursuing regulatory rollbacks and a legislative agenda that will drive up the cost of college, make investments in higher education risky for borrowers, and is dismantling the data infrastructure that we need to make informed decisions and informed investments in higher ed. And so at TICAS, the Institute for College Access and Success, historically, and we've been around 20 years, we're really oriented toward policy development, policy design, helping policymakers think about ways to tweak and improve regulations and legislation. Now we find ourselves facing this sort of existential crisis moment where we're trying to play a whack-a-mole game that will hopefully mitigate some of the harm that we see coming down the pike for students, for institutions, for the idea of a research enterprise that supports the important generation of knowledge that our faculty colleagues are doing. So to have to adapt to that, not in 100 days, but really right out of the gate in January to today has been obviously an exhausting process and one that we're still grappling with and wrapping our heads around from day to day, whether it's from executive orders or following what's happening in Congress and the courts. So that sort of macro shift has been a real challenge for us to think about our place and how to convene and inform and hopefully mitigate and staunch some of that harm.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. I'm happy to jump in as well. And I'm going to focus on the dismantling of the data infrastructure that both Jackie and Kyle mentioned. But first, I want to say a few words about the Institute for Higher Education Policy, who we are and what we do. So we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research, policy, and advocacy organization committed to building a more just and equitable society through higher education. We lead the Post-Secondary Value Collaborative, a coalition of researchers, organizations, others that advocate for the collection and responsible use of high-quality post-secondary data. And really core to all of our work is a reliance on quality data to build evidence-based insights to inform policy and practice in ways that really improve student outcomes. And so for us, the administration's really sharp rollback in federal post-secondary data and research capacity is an unprecedented blow to evidence-based policymaking. We're deeply concerned about the dismantling of key federal data infrastructure, including the abrupt cancellation of contracts that power federal data collections like NIPSAS and BPS, the hollowing out of staff knowledge and capacity at the Institute of Education Sciences, with 90% of staff positions eliminated as part of a reduction of force. And those changes deeply, deeply affect how IHEP and others in the field can use data to understand student experiences and inform policy and practice. We know that federal data are essential for evidence-based policymaking and consumer choices. Federal data provide unique insights and a level of scale and comprehensiveness that are just not available from other data sources. And we and many others in the field rely on those data to understand student success, student experiences, measure institutional outcomes, and really ensure that students are all receiving strong outcomes for their higher education experience. So happy to talk more about the details later, but that is a big shift and something that we are deeply concerned about.
I'll jump in next. So I'm teaching a PhD seminar on higher education finance on Monday evenings this spring. And I find myself having to take a quick break in the middle of class to check my phone to see what in the world is going on. Because the number of layoffs, cancellations, and policy shifts that have happened in the 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern hour on Monday itself has been pretty staggering. I think that the biggest takeaway from me is last year, the Supreme Court had a decision that was supposed to rein in the ability of the executive branch to act without Congress. And instead, we've seen at least a tripling down of efforts to make changes through administrative policies, through executive actions, including withholding of money, cancellation of contracts. And all this is, I mean, it was really kind of put to a head with the skinny budget proposal that came out on Friday, which resulted in numerous longstanding programs like TRIO proposed to be canceled. So how I spent my morning is talking with my faculty and staff about what do we do if we lose our TRIO programs that serve rural Appalachia.
Yeah, so it's so difficult to pick your biggest, right? So I guess I will say the current administration's shift toward authoritarianism is the biggest challenge for higher education policy. It's sort of what girds all of the conversations that each one of us is talking about when it comes to things like shifts in how data is collected, allowed to be shared, when it comes to the ways that people are being kidnapped off the streets who happen to be students, and that is not by accident, in a way that makes it such that the federal government is very clearly engaged in attacking, as I believe Kyle said, higher education in the United States in order to both make certain institutions be an example for others, in addition to releasing executive orders that do not have the weight of congressional decisions, but are treated as such. And I think part of the reason that I mentioned that authoritarianism piece is a lot of the things we're going to talk about today are not actually supposed to be under the purview of a president is able to just sort of do this thing and then it's done. We can talk about the canceled contracts. We can talk about a number of these moves, again, kidnapping people off the street. Like all of these different moves are things that Congress could choose to step in and make other decisions about. And so I think it's important as we think about these first 100 days that we're always keeping in mind, like the executive branch does not stand alone. The executive branch cannot do these types of things on its own without Congress tacitly approving in some fashion. And so that matters a lot for sort of all the things that we're going to think about today. So I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted that point.
Thank you, panelists. And the next couple of questions will really build on the topics and threads that you all discussed in this initial question. So you'll all be able to kind of expand more. So several executive orders and Office for Civil Rights guidance have mandated the elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion focused offices, programs, and initiatives across federal agencies and institutions. More recently, federal and state level actions, including threats to in-state tuition eligibility for undocumented students and efforts to deputize campus police as immigration enforcement officers, pose escalating threats for international and undocumented students. What long-term consequences do you foresee from these actions? And what promising responses or strategies have you seen from institutional leaders, faculty, students, or external organizations in navigating these challenges?
That's a lot to chew on, but I will attempt to sort of get us started. And I think really stems well from Dr. Baker's comments, to read about political pressure that, say, our colleagues in Florida are facing to deputize their campus police and have them serve as de facto immigration officers, I think speaks to a larger conversation about what are we signaling campuses and institutions of higher education are for, and who is going to be welcome and safe there. And I think we'll get to a larger conversation about thinking about return on investment and how people are thinking about their attitudes toward higher education generally. But as to OCR, I think ProPublica had some new data this morning that in March, 91% of complaints that came in were dismissed, and about 89% in April. Generally, about 70% of cases are found to not have enough evidence to go on. But you've already seen a notable rise in the dismissiveness of complaints that OCR is receiving. Of course, regional offices have been gutted for OCR. And so what we're really seeing is that it's important to remember that the Higher Education Act was set up as civil rights legislation, and it's the Higher Ed Act of 1965 for no accident. And the Department of Education should be standing as a backstop of support as a civil rights agency and as a protector of student interests. And what we're seeing is instead inverting that mission and using arms like OCR as weapons against institutions, really for the goal of scoring political points and making a case to the administration's base of support. And so that's all, of course, deeply concerning for the kind of things that we all care about in terms of access and affordability and equity and all the things that we talk about through the years. But it's hard to express the extent to which this is an existential crisis for our students and our campus communities. And I'll be frank, I've seen so far a real paucity of pushback from institutional leaders. The president of Kentucky Wesleyan University, Michael Roth's been very outspoken in terms of working against Project 2025, even since before the election, has continued to do so. We welcome litigation from institutions that have been attacked by the administration. But Harvard can raise $700 million overnight to raise a legal defense fund. Our students and the communities that are being threatened by these actions probably are in a position to do that. So it's encouraging to see, I hope, nascent pushback and more institutional courage. I'm heartened by as a Big Ten alum, I'm heartened by the Big Ten institutions working through a faculty-led initiative to have something of a kind of NATO-style compact for when one is attacked by the administration. They'll work to support each other. These kinds of things, I hope, are the cornerstones for some stronger efforts to say that, at least for now, the law should still matter, and we can't have an administration just roguely ignore court orders, and we have to find ways to use litigation and activism and other tools to push back against these actions.
Yes, I'll hop in. I'll strongly Kyle was outlining a lot of my thoughts. And I don't believe in repeating, so I will say like ditto. And I really think from a long-term perspective, we have to be thinking about a shift for international students choosing to come to the United States for like very reasonable decision making, deciding that being kidnapped to another country or put into detention within the United States in deplorable conditions is not something that they're interested in doing. And so I think long term, we are talking about the health of the U.S. higher education system, but in particular, I think when this sort of dovetails with what I think about have been like promising tools to push back, things like the Big Ten Defense Compact, things like thinking about the way the Georgetown's law school pushed back against certain political incursions on their academic freedom. And one of the sort of unifying pieces here is around sort of like, what is the mission of U.S. higher education? And I find the most and so I think that the long-term consequences are the potential to erode and potentially destroy that work. And the things that I'm most hopeful about are when I see people upholding and adhering to what that mission is supposed to be around democracy and inquiry, all those sorts of really squishy things that really matter far beyond things like return on investment from a community college versus a four-year institution, right? Like that those elements are the ones that are the most under threat, in part because those are the types of things that threaten authoritarian power. So freedom of inquiry, all of those sorts of pieces. And so I think those types of things are heartening. And I'll particularly highlight the spaces I'm most heartened by are K-12 schools. And that is because the people that work within K-12 schools have been doing their darndest to ensure that they know their rights, that they know when people can access spaces and when they cannot. We have seen several instances of people across the country putting their bodies in front of members of their community and saying, you will not harm them. And I think that is the type of solidarity that we need when we try to think about these long-term attacks that are targeted against international students and documented students, things of that nature.
And coming as an academic administrator at a red state public university, it's an entirely different space here where leadership at similar institutions generally have not spoken out. Looking at the list of the 400 plus signatories, there are only a precious few at red state institutions, and they're either very swingy states or they're community colleges. Because basically any other leader that speaks out runs the risk of either being fired or having their institution lose substantial money. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, I worry about the future of this association. I worry about state legislators saying this organization should not be supported and faculty and staff cannot travel to ASHE conferences in the future. I worry about that. And the work that can be done in the spaces that many of us are in is trying to do our best behind the scenes to support students. The international students piece, I think, is getting some attention because it does have an economic development component, and we have a lot of international businesses that like international students. So there are some ways to provide support, but it is an extremely different ballpark when you're playing in Tennessee versus a state like Delaware.
So I will throw out there that the University of Delaware's president did not sign. So don't worry.
Did resign.
Well, yes, that is the email we got in our inbox today. But so, just throwing it out there that like blue states and red states, not always so far apart when it comes to being complicit.
Thanks, everyone. So next question. With the resumption of student debt collection and ongoing uncertainty around student aid, what impacts do you foresee on enrollment, retention, institutional strategy, and higher ed more broadly? And what guidance can researchers and institutional leaders take from this moment to better understand and address the consequences for both students and institutions?
So if it's okay, I'm going to start us off with like just a little mini anecdote. Okay, so picture this. Wow, that was my Golden Girls moment. All right, picture this, Sicily. So earlier this year, I'm doing an interview with a reporter, and they're asking me sort of what would it mean if the things that the current administration has said they want to do actually come to fruition within the Department of Education. What might that mean? Broad strokes. And I did the thing that academics do. We love to put a conditional if then maybe type situation, right? So we never want to say like something definitively. So I said something like, I'm concerned that there's potential that next year federal financial aid might not be smooth, like something of that nature. I put a lot of caveats, all sorts of stuff, right? And that reporter came back to me a little bit later and said, hey, I just want to check in because, in the story, I wrote up what you said and my editors like stopped me and said like, whoa, hey, like, just want to check to make sure that's like really alarming what she said. Could you like check back in with her? And I was like, oh, the like 15 caveat statement was alarming. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I can tell you, I stand by it. I 100% stand by what I said. These are the reasons why I stand by what I said. And like to their credit, to the editor's credit, right? Like they ran with it. And here we are. And I don't think anyone would say that like I was crazy to have said that before, but I think it's important to highlight that point to say that I think a lot of higher ed researchers have been concerned about student loans, student financial aid generally, in a way that we are starting to see more of the public be concerned about. But I want to highlight that everyone who is on this panel is listening to this panel ever. They are not general members of the public. And so I am trying to always keep in mind that like for most people, the stuff we're about to talk about, they don't know that these things are concerns. So I have concerns about this is what I will say. If we are preparing for the potential that Social Security payments can be delayed months, I don't know why anyone would think that Pell Grant disbursements to universities are more politically protected than Social Security payments. And so what that means is I've actually been having conversations with CFOs across the country about what happens if your disbursement from the federal government is late. If it's a month late, can you make payroll? If it's 2 months late, what do you have to figure out? What does that mean from a staff support perspective? What does that mean for operations on campus, classes, how they can be run, et cetera, et cetera? And trying the best to help people to think through what do you do if the money is late next year? Because I think the biggest concern for next academic year is whether through malintent or incompetence, that the money winds up not getting to the universities in the timely manner that it was supposed to. I'll defer to other people as well.
And from which institutions are affected, there are several hundred institutions that are on heightened cash monitoring lists from the Department of Education. And those are the ones where if there are fewer people working at the department in that area, and it seems like there are fewer, I worry about those institutions the most. And from an institutional strategy perspective, I mean, I'm hearing already that some of the bigger flagship public universities that are freaked out about losing research funds are turning to their wait lists in an effort to increase tuition revenue. Those students come from somewhere else, and I'm concerned about our regional public and private institutions even more as a result of that.
I just want to mention what's happening in the House right now in terms of the legislation that was moving last week. I think is relevant. We're talking about student debt collection, but as for the future of debt and what's being proposed by House Republicans in an effort to find somewhere around $330 to $350 billion of cuts to higher education. What they're proposing includes getting rid of subsidized loans for students. They'll have interest accruing while enrolled, eliminating the Graduate Plus program to further restrict access to loans for graduate education. It's going to, on the income-driven repayment model, would extend your time to repayment from 20 or 25 to 30 years. So you'll have more people who will still be paying at least some monthly payment when their kids are probably going through college or even after. We're going to see revocation of important student protections. We're going to see it being harder for folks to work while also being able to meet credit hour requirements to qualify for full Pell, limiting access for half-time or less students, all while also in that bill is wedging in the workforce Pell idea for us to just use Pell for very short-term programs. That's a big and decade-old policy conversation that's being put into a reconciliation plan that really should be about just budget questions, not major policy changes, particularly ones that would put a lot more pressure on a Pell program that's already facing a $3 billion shortfall this fiscal year and $10 billion after. The bill does sort of throw some money at that problem, but not enough to cover the extent of the shortfall. So this is an actual bill that was moved through the House Education Committee. It's anyone's guess how it fares on the floor or over in the Senate, but it is a marker of how some policymakers in Congress are thinking about the future of federal support for students through higher ed, and the continuing problem of student debt, as we know, will continue to run up those debts, especially for borrowers of color who will struggle to make repayment. So across the board, yes, there's an important conversation about the debt now, but going forward, if this is going to be the direction of how we're going to expect students to cover the cost of attendance, we're only going to be in a deeper hole going forward.
And I just want to jump in quickly on Kyle's comments to draw the connection between those policy proposals and federal data that we have long relied on federal data to understand what the impact of many of those proposals are. Researchers rely on NPSAS, the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study, to look at borrowing habits, who is borrowing, looking at repayment outcomes through the longitudinal studies. Just honing in on one of the Pell changes to redefine full-time from 12 credits to 15 credits. The most recent data we have on credit taking among Pell recipients is the Beginning Post-Secondary Students longitudinal study for students who started in 2012. I mean, that was such a long time ago. There was a study for students who started in 2020, but that was part of the contract that was canceled. So we don't know if we're going to see it, and it really hinders evidence-based policymaking and the ability of researchers, practitioners, advocates to understand what these changes are going to do to students.
So for this next question, everyone can answer, but Diane, actually, if you could start us off, that would be great. Just given your role at IHEP, the dismantling of federal data systems and funding cuts to the Department of Education pose significant challenges for data-driven policy and research. What are the impacts of these administrative actions on data-driven policy and research, and how can researchers, advocates, and institutions adapt and respond to protect critical data infrastructure?
Thanks, Jackie. So as I mentioned, we are really losing critical data infrastructure that underpins evidence-based policymaking through these federal actions. I mentioned the contracts that were canceled for NPSAS and BPS. Again, these are large, nationally representative studies that provide crucial insights about affordability, how students pay for college, enrollment, degree completion, post-college outcomes, on-campus experiences. And these studies are unique compared to a lot of the other data collections that exist in the field. They combine valuable student interview data with administrative data, such as FAFSA data that's really only available through the federal government. And those interview questions include demographic data that allow us to hone in on the experience of veterans, student parents, first-generation students, a lot of disaggregates that aren't available from a lot of other administrative sources. These data are relied upon by researchers, policymakers, stakeholders across the field. I mentioned our ability to understand the changes that were proposed in the House Reconciliation Bill last week, but there's also past examples where policymakers have used research based on federal data, like NIPSAS research on the cost of FAFSA complexity is what spurred then Senator Lamar Alexander to start his legislative efforts to simplify the FAFSA that led to all the changes. We know that the GAO, Government Accountability Office, recently used NIPSAS data to study student eligibility and take-up for means-tested benefits like SNAP. And that is just a small list of examples of all the ways that we use federal data to help inform and understand policies. There are also impacts of recent actions on data access for data that's already been collected. The department has ended remote access to restricted use data, a more granular version, a way to access Department of Ed data. And there has been a way to do it remotely, not have to set up a physical cold room that meets strict security requirements. That's ending on June 1st, coming up real soon. We've also experienced some long delays in the department approving data that we had analyzed using our restricted use license. It used to take 5 to 10 business days. We've been waiting months. We're not sure what's going to happen with that. We've also been experiencing intermittent technical problems with Data Lab, the online tool to access to publicly access Department of Ed studies like NIPSAS and BPS. And we have concerns about how staff cuts will affect the public release of data like iPads. As we're thinking about what would be helpful for the field to do, we want to emphasize that now is really the time for researchers, policymakers, advocates to use their voice and speak up about how they use federal data and what will be lost when those systems disappear. And this includes providing examples of how data have informed institutional systems, state practice, how it is helping students, and what's breaking when processes are breaking down. We know that the iPads data collection went down for a few days. So getting a handle on what's happening and elevating that for policymakers. At the same time, we still encourage institutions and states to continue collecting and using their own data to inform decision-making and drive improvements, collecting disaggregated data to the extent they're able to identify disparities and ensure that all students have a meaningful opportunity to succeed. But within all of that, we can't lose sight that these non-federal sources, they're very valuable, but they are no substitute for robust, comprehensive, and comparable federal post-secondary data. We really need all of those pieces in the infrastructure, and we can't lose the federal side.
I'll just highlight on there that all of those contracts that we're talking about that were canceled were illegally canceled. So I want to just make sure I also note that there are ways that the federal government can initiate the cancellation of a contract, and that is not what occurred in any of these circumstances. And this is why, again, there is also a role that Congress could play, because several of the contracts that were that have had issues, et cetera, have been illegally canceled or have just been stymied and so really can't be done, are for congressionally mandated data, things that Congress says is supposed to have happen. And so that's part of the reason why, again, sort of at the top, one of the things I really wanted to highlight is that none of these things could happen if Congress didn't want them to happen. So there's also a role to play for talking to congressional representatives, to making clear the fact that if you say that congressional mandates mean something, then Congress could step in and say that the executive branch is not allowed to illegally cancel these contracts.
No one else oh, I was going to say, go ahead, Kyle.
I stand with my colleagues. I have nothing else to add to that.
Wonderful.
And just super fast. Foundations do not have enough money to support the data collection. They can pick up a few key parts, but we might have 5% of what we need.
Mhm. Yeah. So for our next question, the administration's agenda is advancing a broader narrative about the role and purpose of higher education and further eroding public trust in higher education. How can researchers, institutional leaders, and advocates work together to rebuild trust in higher education? And what role should researchers play in challenging or reshaping public perceptions of the sector?
I'm happy to start us off on this one. I'll just recognize that there is a broad and growing interest from policymakers and the public in understanding the value that higher education provides. A lot of the focus has been on a return on investment, post-secondary value, comparing students' post-college outcomes in economic sense with some kind of counterfactual of what students would have, what we think students would have experienced had they not gone to college. I did want to recognize, though, the points that Dominique brought up about the non-economic benefits of higher education, that those are all really important too. As we're thinking about public perceptions, we're questioning the value of college. We've seen certainly survey data showing an increase there. We think that researchers, institutions, and advocates what they can do is work together to spotlight where value is being delivered to students and identify opportunities for improvement. We think that transparency is a first step toward rebuilding trust, but we also need to use data to design real improvements in policy and practice. It can't just start with end with the measurement. I also wanted to recognize that at the heart of a lot of the skepticism about whether college is worth it is the concerns around affordability and rising costs. And that is an area that does need more research and policy attention. We conducted research a couple years ago using NIPSAS data showing that students with the lowest incomes would need nearly 150% of their household income to afford a four-year college just for 1 year. And we see from lots of other data that people are doing across the field, the affordability challenges, the basic needs challenges that students are facing. And there's a real need to address those. And I think that will be key to rebuilding trust and making people feel like college is worth it, because we know from the data overall that college is worth it for most students. And despite the opportunities for improvement at certain programs, certain institutions, certain groups of students.
I think those are all great and helpful comments. I remembered, I think just maybe 2 months ago, our colleagues at New America released some data, I think done from Gallup and Lumina, on that public perception question. And I just pulled those numbers that showed that they surveyed 6,000 people. 70% of adults without a college degree said there was a value to a bachelor's degree. But only 18% said they think that college is fairly priced, and that number was 60% for four-year schools. But interestingly, 90% of currently enrolled students said that the investment they were making in college was worth it. And to Diane's point, the data show they're right, but there is certainly a public perception challenge. We alluded to that earlier, though, when we're thinking about the kind of campus environments that we're seeing, and if we're not walking but running away from all those beautifully crafted commitments to DEI that we saw 4 or 5 years ago. I think that we are going to continue to have real tough conversations about who these institutions are for and what they're signaling to today's students. And if we're shifting our financial aid policy to only be more accommodating of higher income individuals, that's only going to cascade that effect. I'm mindful that for-profit colleges and generally have done a pretty good job of telling their story, and they have pretty robust marketing campaigns and aggressive recruitment, and that enables them to get into communities and unfortunately often use exploitative practices to do so. We're about to roll back a lot of the protections against that. I'm not saying that nonprofit and public institutions should follow their playbooks, but I am saying that they can probably be more engaged in the public square and share their story in more compelling ways and make the case for the value of higher education as about as sound an investment as you can make for the future of your kids or for yourself and your own economic outlook. I don't think that we as a field have done that very well historically, and might want to think about other ways we can do that. And I alluded earlier to presidential leadership as well, and I think maybe the horse is out of the barn on just looking to our presidents as like the primary fundraisers for our institutions, and maybe their top lobbyists, but they also have historically played a really important role as shapers of public opinion and of thinking about what are the values that we have for education and society. I'm mindful of UCLA's Professor Eddie Cole's book on the campus color line about the role of presidents and the civil rights movement. These kinds of historical lessons and examples, I think, should be informative as we think about like what's the role of institutional leadership in these kinds of critical public conversations that. And as someone who went to an undergraduate school in Tennessee, I'm very sensitive to Robert's point about how that's different in different places. And so each person has to be reflective about the appropriate ways to weigh in and use their own powers of persuasion. But I think there's more of a role for higher ed and higher ed leaders to help shape public perceptions and make the case for higher education in a more compelling way than we have in recent decades.
And from a faculty perspective, making that public case for higher ed has been a pretty risky proposition, because for those of us in either contingent or even tenure track positions, that's the sort of thing that's often not rewarded. And as higher ed scholars and leaders, we have the potential to at least start doing something about that, encouraging and legitimately rewarding service and public engaged scholarship can help. It can help. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but at least it gives people a chance to do good work, get it out there, and not just be solely focused on can they get an article in the best journal.
So I'm thinking, stepping back a little bit more philosophically, about two things. So one is competition, and then the other is sort of whose trust. So for the competition part, I think part of the challenge, and I really appreciate Kyle bringing up how for-profits do an exceptional job of showing their value. One of the things I do when I'm teaching and I'm introducing students to for-profits is I play ads so I used to work in Texas, and so I would play an ad for the University of Phoenix, I'd play an ad for Southern Methodist University, and I'd play an ad for UT Austin. And I would ask the students, I'd start with the other, University of Phoenix would be my last one, and I'd ask the students, tell me about this university. I'm just gonna play this ad for you. What does it say? What does it show you about the institution? And when you get to the University of Phoenix, it's just light years different, because it's talking about changing your life, changing your world in a way that we don't talk about these other institutions. And so I think that's an incredibly important point. Part of the challenge I find is that a lot of institutions focus on making the case for why that singular institution has value. And it's much more rare for institutions to talk about why the sector of higher education in the United States has value. The more often than not, institutions are trying to push for their value in order to increase their individual enrollment numbers. And that competition piece is then at odds with the solidarity that we might want to see when talking about how to communicate about the value of higher education overall. So I think that's an inherent challenge. It's not impossible, but I think that's an inherent challenge with how we communicate about the value of higher education. The second piece, whose trust? So it's always funny when I talk to people about like public trust, and I frequently, like, one of the most popular questions I get asked about is sort of like, what do we do about the reduction in public trust in higher education? And one of my follow-up questions is always, well, whose trust is eroding and for what reasons? Because everyone's trust is not eroding, A. B, everyone's trust is not eroding for the same reasons. There are people whose trust in higher education is eroding because they think that higher education is brainwashing sets of students to do certain types of things. There are people for whom trust in higher education is eroding because it's unaffordable. There are people for whom trust in higher education is eroding because these institutions made all of these promises in 2020, and now they pretend like they don't know that it's like a new phone who this, like, right? So there are a number of different reasons that are actually contradicting to each other, that are all subsumed within why trust erodes within higher education. And by its very nature, that means that shoring up trust for some people might reduce trust for other people. And so I think a lot of this, to me, pushes me to engage with a lot of the work that comes out of communications, that comes out of media studies. I talk to a lot of scholars in those areas in order to try to better understand how we think about communication. I think often we can sometimes assume, particularly the we that's like in academia, that like communication just happens, that you just say a fact loud enough and repeat it enough, and then voila. And that's not the case, right? Different people are viewed as trusted informants or experts for many different reasons. And sometimes when we can see from the research, the messenger can matter more than the message, right? Like there's just all sorts of elements to this. And so I would say that one of the key pieces to me is trying to better understand why trust erodes, and then making decisions around that, right? If a group of people believe that the earth is flat, and because of that, a university that advocates for saying that the earth is round is something that they have lost trust in, that's a very different approach that you need to take to rebuild trust. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to rebuild trust with those people, but I'm saying that that's a very different approach than changing your website or cutting an ad. And so I think those are the types of things, like those are the hard questions that we have to be engaging with when we think about what does it mean for trust to erode. And then coming back to, again, I think it's really hard in a world where institutions, and sort of like Robert was mentioning this, like the concern that more resourced institutions that are more research focused will sort of snatch students, which then means that the regional publics or more open access institutions could lose enrollments, and that can have knock-on effects. That's all about competition. That's all about different institutions competing with each other instead of thinking about what solidarity might look like.
Thank you to our panelists. I don't see any questions in the Q&A function, but please, if we probably have time for one, if folks have any questions. If not, we have more questions, but wanted to provide folks with the opportunity to ask one question to our panelists. If not, I will just end with our last question. I don't see anything. So as a council dedicated to shaping policy research and ensuring that its members are at the table in key policy discussions, how do you see CPPHE responding to the current political climate and the challenges higher education faces? What kind of support can and should CPPHE provide to its members, especially in these tumultuous times, to help them stay engaged, informed, and impactful in advancing equitable policy change?
So I think to take this a little bit more narrowly, just thinking about what can we provide for support for both all the individuals within the council who have lost their jobs and the individuals who are suddenly in very precarious situations. And even what can we do to remind people who are in more privileged positions as tenured faculty members that the world has changed and what was possible and expected for tenure and promotion may very well not be so in the next couple of years or potentially even longer than that. I think we have the ability to help shape the field in some positive directions on that. There are lots of other bigger challenges, but that's something that we can do locally that doesn't depend on others.
I love this so much that I'm just going to jump in real quick for like concrete pieces. So, Robert, you're shocked. I loved everything you said. For tenure, for P&T, number one thing to me is that P&T committees in universities need to be having conversations immediately about what people can and cannot do in our current environment, and then figuring out ways to communicate that effectively, particularly to external letter writers, et cetera, all of that jazz. I will also say part of the reason that I, as a tenured faculty member, will be very loud about all of these things, right, is because I have relatively more security in my job, and that matters. I think we have to do what we can to equip people to be able to do that. And I think one of the things that CPPHE can do is to help people gain those skills. I teach a evidence-based policy communication class here at the Public Policy School. And one of the things I talk a lot to my students about is we assume that the skill of communicating is one that is innate, that people are just born talking good. And that's just not true. People spend a lot of time and energy crafting their abilities to communicate effectively to different audiences. And so finding ways to help people to be able to do that, coupled with, as Robert was saying, the ability to help reward them for that, or to make clear, right, the stakes that you doing these types of things might help make it easier for people to not be kidnapped off the streets. That like those are the types of, that might be nice motivation for some, that being able to develop those skills, nurture those skills, right, I think is really, really important. And I think CPPHE could help with.
I love all that. And but probably according to some policymakers, I'm one of those people that wasted his time getting an American Studies degree as an undergraduate. But I think about it a lot because it does make clear to me how we have lived through regressive cycles of history. And so maybe it's a good time to look at the Know Nothing era and Reconstruction and the Gilded Age and the Bracero program and so much else when we have gone backwards. And I think one thing that we learned in COVID was we were in such a rush to, quote, get back to normal. We didn't have the parallel conversation of what's something new and better we can build on the other side. And so, yes, this is terribly challenging for so many people in our community and communities across the country. We have to use stories and voices and activism to push against that. But we also need to make spaces to sort of carve the cornerstones what we'll build next. And so if there's any hope that I can find or a stone of hope to leave this conversation with, it will be that.
And I love all these ideas as well. The one thing I wanted to mention, reiterate, is the power of your voice. That if there's an opportunity for CPPHE to elevate members' voices and take the stories of the tangible impact of these data, of research cuts on individuals, on scholars, on departments, on students, that could be a really helpful way for the association to step in. That, op-eds showing up in podcasts is helpful, but even just LinkedIn posts and blog posts do get traction with media and policymakers. I think there is a lot that is happening now. So making sure that the impacts of the higher education changes are part of the public discussion is really important, and something that you all have the stories and the power to do something about.
Well, I'm just going to jump in right here because this is such incredible guidance and recommendations. I can't thank you enough. We recognize that we are in a moment where this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. This is the next, oh gosh, I don't even want to say how many years that we're going to be involved in this. And CPPHE is taking that charge very seriously. We are actually starting a strategic planning process to see and how CPPHE can respond to this moment. And by deliberately engaging with our members and developing programming that aligns with everything that you all have said. Dominique, absolutely. What you just said about the communication piece. I remember having a conversation several months ago before the pre-con, Brian Bridges talking about the need for research and how that research needs to inform the people in these positions of influence. But what are the things that we need to do to make sure it gets into their hands? So a lot of what you're talking about, Diane, is absolutely, the LinkedIn's blog post, Kyle, engaging in the public square, and Robert, what you said about we need to change our promotion tenure and promotion policy so that that kind of scholarship is in fact recognized. So thank you all for your recommendations. Before we close, I invite everybody to take a look at this poll where there are so many topics. Each single one of these can be its own webinar. And we did not have time for this incredible panel to respond to every single thing, but we invite you to please respond to this poll. Let us know what you want to hear about because we want to do this as part of our programming with CPPHE today, tomorrow, the next coming months, and definitely at the pre-con. So thank you all for your participation today, the panelists for your incredible insights. We hope to continue this conversation in many different forms. And again, thank you all. This is fantastic. I really appreciate you all for taking the time and putting yourselves out there because this is difficult times, difficult conversations, but we are grateful for your contributions. Thank you all.
Thank you.